Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Contours podcast series. I'm your host for today, Eugene Chaosofsky, and I'll be talking to my colleagues Andrew Loftusness and Jared Jeter about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. A more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics can be found in the weekly forecast monitor that New Lines publishes every Friday. The weekly forecast monitor examines various forecast scenarios for geopolitical hotspots around the world and the risks and opportunities that such scenarios can entail. So, Andrew, it's been an exceptionally eventful week. What are some of the most important developments that you've been tracking from this week?
Yeah, quite a bit going on right now. This week, the United States and Israel launched air and naval-based attacks against Iran, killing Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and leading to retaliatory strikes by Iran against neighboring Gulf states, as well as the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Meanwhile, talks between Russia and Ukraine have been postponed as a result of this regional and global fallout of the strikes from Iran, which has detracted, of course, from diplomatic efforts which had been scheduled to take place in Abu Dhabi. Meanwhile, in the Indo-Pacific, China held its annual National People's Congress, where it approved the new five-year plan. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney signed deals with both India and Australia. And then in the Americas, the U.S. eased some pressure on Cuba, allowing Venezuelan oil to be sold to Cuba's private sector, while U.S. officials have threatened Venezuelan interim leader Delcy Rodriguez with indictment.
Got it. Thanks, Andrew. So let's start off, obviously, with the Middle East, which we'll be focusing on primarily for this podcast, the U.S., Israel, and Iranian conflict. I should note that we are recording this podcast on the morning of Thursday, March 5th, so obviously a lot of fast-moving developments there. And also we'll note that we had anticipated a high degree of military escalation for listeners that will remember in our previous two podcasts, as well as in our annual forecast report, that this was a key geopolitical hotspot to look out for military escalation, which we are now in the process of seeing. So, Andrew, let's start off. First of all, can you update us on what have been the U.S. and Israeli operations and the military developments inside of Iran specifically?
Yeah, quite a bit to get into, but so on February 28th, the United States and Israel kicked off a war against Iran, so far consisting of a high-intensity and sustained air and naval campaign. The war started with an opening blow from the Israelis, who killed the Iranian supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. From what we understand, in the first few opening strikes of the war, the U.S. and Israel acted decisively, it must be said, on real-time intelligence that the supreme leader was going to be present at a meeting with a number of senior government leaders, including a number of senior cadre from the IRGC. Since February 28th, there has really been no let-up whatsoever from the U.S. or from Israel. What we're seeing so far is that most of the strikes have been against both intelligence and security facilities. There's a lot of talk about, for example, IRGC headquarters being bombed across the country. No question that's a priority for both the U.S. and Israel. But the longer this war goes on and the longer the bombardment campaign goes on, they will certainly be working down a list of priority targets, really trying to dismantle IRGC, not only infrastructure, but the ability to suppress any future popular uprisings. More on that in just a moment. Other targets include the private homes of Iranian officials, from the government and the military, both at the elite senior level all the way down to the mid-level. And then, of course, any number of standard conventional military targets. A major priority for both the U.S. and Israel, of course, is to severely degrade, if not outright eliminate, Iran's ballistic missile capability and their weapons supplies, to eliminate both that threat to Israeli territory and the regional threat that Iran poses to the United States and its Arab allies in the Gulf. Again, more on that later. But the initial objective here, from what we can tell, is to, just to put it straightforward, to kill the Iranian leadership and to destroy Iran's ability to retaliate against either the United States or Israel in a meaningful way. Also, now we have to include in those retaliatory targets the Gulf states, which have endured quite a bit in the opening days of the war. We'll cover that in a moment. Another stated objective from the United States is the destruction of the Iranian Navy. The updates that we've seen both from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the Pentagon and some statements from CENTCOM lead us to believe that the U.S. is close to accomplishing this, if this is not already complete by the time this recording is released. As far as casualty reports go, I would caution listeners right now. I looked into this. Obviously, quite a bit is still unclear. Everything about this situation is rapidly evolving on the ground. I've seen different reports saying that there are at least 1,000 civilian casualties so far inside Iran. I've seen other reports saying that there are at least 1,000 IRGC or military casualties inside Iran within the first 5 days of the war. Again, I want to stress that the smoke is quite literally still settling on a number of these locations, and there's a great deal that we don't have clarity on right now.
Got it. Thanks, Andrew. So yeah, quite a significant military escalation out of the U.S. and Israel on Iran, obviously. But this has not gone, without a response from Iran. Actually, quite a significant and wide response in terms of its scope and scale. So what can you update us in terms of Iran's military activities over the past week or so?
Right. So notably, when the U.S. has either considered or actually carried out direct military action against Iran over the years, especially during both of the Trump administrations, the main deterrent factor was the possibility of a regional war, of Iran attacking any number of states in the Gulf. That did not happen to the extent that we're seeing now. This is a different ballgame after the killing of Qasem Soleimani or after the bombing of Iranian nuclear facilities last May. However, this time around, the war has truly become regional, and it did so within a matter of hours after U.S. and Israeli attacks started inside Iranian territory. So a key element of Iranian retaliation has been to attack all of its neighbors, essentially, at least 6 Gulf states. We're tracking that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman have taken Iranian fire so far in the form of missiles and or drones. In Kuwait, at least 6 American soldiers were killed by an Iranian drone strike, again, in the opening hours of Iran's retaliation. And then looking outside of the Gulf, there's also been a significant amount of Iranian bombardment in Iraq, particularly in northern Iraq and the Kurdish regions. More on that in a moment. But there's obviously quite a significant U.S. military and diplomatic presence there, as well as in Jordan, which of course is also host to a significant U.S. military presence and has been for some time. In the Gulf states in particular, there's been fairly extensive targeting of energy infrastructure, of what appears to be random civilian infrastructure, such as hotels and transportation facilities, as well as, of course, U.S. military bases, but also U.S. diplomatic posts, including a drone strike against the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh.
Understood. So a lot of activity, as you said, in Iran's immediate vicinity, in both the Gulf region as well as closer to the Levant. And speaking of that, we've also seen the introduction of another theater, or a reintroduction of a theater in terms of Israel and Lebanon and the role of Hezbollah. So what can you update us there?
Right. So Hezbollah initiated an attack against Israel following the death of the supreme leader in Iran. Public statements from senior Hezbollah officials said that this was, I'm paraphrasing these Hezbollah PR releases here, but they said this is essentially a return to the resistance as opposed to retaliation for the death of the Ayatollah in Tehran. It has to be said that from a strategic standpoint, this is a very rash and dangerous move from Hezbollah. Again, I'm looking at this from their own perspective and their own, not just long-term, but immediate interests. A number of reports that I've seen out there have described it as, quote, suicidal for Hezbollah, both for the literal survival of its leadership as well as its viability as an institution within the Iranian proxy network. The Israeli response, of course, was swift and is likely to escalate. So as listeners will know, we've been talking about how while there's notionally a ceasefire in place in Lebanon, and there has been since the war in 2024, there has been an Israeli bombardment campaign that has continued almost daily since then for well over a year now. That has now escalated significantly within hours following these attacks. The Israelis began to bomb Beirut. They escalated their bombing campaign in the south, really all across the country. Israeli soldiers have occupied 5 points of Lebanese territory in the south. Again, while this ceasefire was notionally in place, they pretty much immediately expanded that occupation. It's not quite a full force, full scale invasion yet, like we've seen in 2024. There is a significant possibility that will take place. But what we know right now with certainty is that the Israelis are rapidly escalating their bombardment campaign, both with its scope across the entire country of Lebanon, as well as simply the number of airstrikes that they are carrying out. It remains to be seen right now just how far they will take that, but a lot of Israeli senior defense officials are promising that this will be, and again, I'm paraphrasing here, but that this will be the last war between Israel and Hezbollah. More on that in the coming weeks, I am certain. Looking around the rest of the region very quickly, NATO air defenses intercepted an Iranian ballistic missile that entered Turkish airspace. That's very significant for a number of reasons. Had that gone wrong, had that interception not taken place, and we don't know where that missile was heading, but Turkey, of course, I'll remind listeners, is a NATO ally and has, in fact, the second largest army in NATO, and of course has significant security and diplomatic concerns with its neighbor in Iran and across the entire region. And then finally, and also quite notably, the U.S. Navy torpedoed and sunk an Iranian destroyer in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Sri Lanka on March 4th. This is the first time a submarine has done so since World War II, which is an interesting historical note. But the real takeaway here is that this, as we noted, this war expanded regionally within hours. There's global ramifications that we will continue to discuss. And as far as operations go, the U.S. is clearly sending a message that it intends to target the Iranian military and security apparatuses in general across the globe.
Right. So quite an expansive targets that you discussed there. And I should also mention, in addition to all of those zones of attack, that there was also Iranian activity that targeted as far as Cyprus in the Mediterranean, as well as Azerbaijan just north of Iran. So clearly not just a Middle East focused or constrained conflict, and one that's kind of rippling out both regionally and globally. And we'll get into the global implications in just a moment. But before we do that, I think it is worth zeroing in and spending a few minutes on the domestic situation within Iran, both on the political and security side of things. We're looking for the potential for destabilization as these military operations are underway. So what can you update us, Andrew, on the state of both security and political developments within Iran?
Right. So again, this is really where things are rapidly evolving on the ground. Right now, of course, neither the U.S. or Israel has a ground force that it is supporting inside of Iran. This is purely an air and naval bombardment campaign for now. Now, there are quite a few reports out there indicating that the U.S. is considering and likely, I think, close to commencing a CIA-backed Kurdish insurgency inside of Iran. We understand that Trump has spoken with senior Iranian and Iraqi Kurdish leaders over the past week, specifically discussing areas of military cooperation. That's quite significant, I think. Now, the Kurdish regions of northern Iraq would be crucial for any such operations that the U.S. might undertake. Again, just because of that significant shared border that would be necessary for any number of logistical efforts that the U.S. would need to sustain any ground effort inside of Iran. Quite a bit that could be said there. The most important thing, though, is what would the purpose of this campaign be? What would the U.S. Be trying to accomplish? Most likely, the objective would be to, and there are a number of unnamed U.S. officials cited by various outlets who have said as much, but the objective would most likely be to create the conditions on the ground for a popular uprising from the Iranian people against the Iranian government. A few ways this could happen, at least in theory, but the idea would basically be to degrade, meaning to fight and destroy Iranian security forces directly with U.S. air support. So essentially, just like we saw in Iraq and Syria with the Kurds, there would be a Kurdish ground element with the U.S. essentially acting as their air force and providing close air support. The institutional memory for that sort of thing is certainly there. The other objective tied into that would be to drain the ability of the Iranian security forces to suppress a massive urban uprising, essentially just create another more immediate problem that they must turn and face. Perhaps the biggest question is who is next in the line of succession to replace the supreme leader. The bottom line right now is that nobody knows for certain. There's quite a bit of speculation out there, quite a bit of informed speculation, but right now that's all it is. Quite simply, we don't know what the Iranians will do next, and to a certain extent, we don't know what they can do next. We don't know who is still alive. Trump himself has said a number of times from the Oval Office very recently that a number of senior to mid-level Iranian leaders that the U.S. and Israel had their eye on as potential viable candidates to step up and replace the Ayatollah have in fact already been killed. A number of them is what we're being told. Now, with that being said, the supreme leader's son, Mojtaba Khamenei, is widely considered to be the most likely contender. That's all we know for now. There has not been a decision announced yet from the Iranians. I checked just before we started recording. Again, very quickly evolving situation that might not even be a viable choice at the moment, but no doubt we will know soon. And then finally, the last question that we have to ask to understand the domestic situation inside Iran is what is the potential for a mass uprising and these mass protest movements that the U.S. is really kind of banking on to arise one way or another to accomplish its objectives from this war. From everything we have been reading and discussing and analyzing over the last few weeks and few months, really, I think it's fair to say that the will among the Iranian people is absolutely there. I'll note as an example that campus protests resumed just a couple of days before the bombardment campaign started, and these campus protests resumed after the very violent suppression from the Iranian state against the mass uprising in January. So we know that the will is there, but the means is another question. At the moment, the answer is probably no. But again, very drastic shifts in the security and political situation inside the ground in Iran are possible. Things that we want to look out for in the coming days are possible defections from the IRGC and the U.S. starting to directly support proxy forces on the ground inside Iran.
Got it. Thanks, Andrew. So yeah, obviously so much to cover here as the situation unfolds. I will note that U.S. President Donald Trump had noted that this operation could last for several weeks, I believe 4 to 5 weeks or potentially even longer. So we're still in the early days of the conventional military campaign. But as you mentioned, Andrew, what we'll be watching for in the immediate aftermath is how the domestic political situation and security situation in Iran unfolds with all of those elements that you mentioned. And before we move on to other hotspots around the world, I did want to just kind of briefly touch on some of the global updates and implications from this conflict. So in the energy sector, we've seen that this war has had a major impact disrupting oil and gas exports out of the Middle East and even causing production stoppages in countries like Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, obviously due to those Iranian attacks on their energy infrastructure, as well as shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. And speaking of that, so the Strait of Hormuz, which is a vital global choke point, one that we've mentioned several times in our previous podcasts, providing about 20% of global oil and LNG or liquefied natural gas flows, has been functionally closed by the Iranians after continuously targeting different commercial vessels and ships through that strait. We've also seen how Iraq has cut production by half to 1.5 million barrels per day. And I should note this is oil production, and Iraq is the second largest OPEC producer. Saudi Aramco has shut down the Ras Tanura refinery following a drone strike. And Qatar, which is the world's largest LNG provider, has experienced disruptions and even halted production due to military attacks on its installations. So clearly a lot of energy disruption. This has had the effect of not only taking offline much oil and natural gas supply, but also having a significant uptick on pricing. If disruption persists, we've seen projections that crude oil prices could approach over $100 to $120 per barrel. And we've also seen natural gas prices increasing sharply, which has impacted, world prices, particularly in places like Europe. So this has been, I think, one of the largest implications from a global trade and energy standpoint that we'll be paying very close attention to moving forward. I also wanted to just briefly touch on a couple of key Iranian partners and key adversaries of the U.S. In terms of their reactions. So starting with Russia, we've seen that the Russian Foreign Ministry has basically denounced U.S. and Israeli war efforts. They called it a, quote, pre-planned and unprovoked act of aggression, calling for de-escalation. While at the same time, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that Moscow is in, quote, constant contact with Iranian leadership. But it is notable that actually Russia has not taken substantial action, at least as of yet, to aid its ally in Iran. And in the meantime, we've also seen Ukraine, for its part, basically offering support in terms of drones and other activities to both the U.S. and several Gulf states. And there are reports that the Pentagon and at least one Gulf government are in talks to buy some Ukrainian-made interceptors in order to fend off Iranian drones. So this is a key element to watch for in terms of both Ukrainian and Russian responses and involvement in this conflict. And then finally, China has also, called against what the U.S. and Israel have launched in Iran, calling those strikes unacceptable. while also offering itself as a mediator, following some of its oil supplies getting attacked. I will note that the Strait of Hormuz, while functionally closed, Iran has reportedly allowed some Chinese ships, or at least energy vessels destined for China, to continue to transit the Strait of Hormuz. So very interesting to see Iran making that exception. But yeah, obviously so much to cover and so much to watch as the situation unfolds, which we'll be sure to update in our next episode. But in the meantime, let's kind of round out and touch on a couple of other global hotspots before we wrap up. And I'll turn to you here now, Jared, to cover the Indo-Pacific. So, in addition to China's moves related to the Iranian theater, there's been some notable moves domestically when it comes to China and in its relations with Taiwan and the U.S. over the past week. So what can you update us on that front?
Yeah, thank you, Eugene. Yeah, in China, we've been seeing domestically, the National People's Congress, or the NPC, has just passed their final approval for their next 5-year plan. And in the plan, they detailed a 7% increase to Chinese military spending, as well as a lot of rhetoric claiming that they're going to be cracking down on Taiwanese separatist activities in an attempt to try and squash the idea of Taiwanese sovereignty. This has been pretty much been in line with what we've been seeing over the last several years during the Xi Jinping administration, this type of increasingly antagonistic rhetoric and an increasing military budget to be able to reach some form of parity with the United States. So this is pretty much kind of business as usual is what we've been seeing over the last several years, although this rhetoric, the frequency of the rhetoric has been escalating over the last 4 or 5 years. Yet, in relation to trying to maintain that longstanding Sino-American relationship, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Trade Representative Jameson Greer are going to be having a preliminary meeting with Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng in preparation for Donald Trump's meeting with Xi Jinping that's going to be taking place at the end of this month in March. These type of preliminary meetings between lower level officials are often pretty common because they want to try to be able to get most of the main talking points clearly scheduled and out of the way. These type of meetings are usually just done so that the scheduling for the agenda for the main heads of state meeting can go a lot more smoothly. And this confrontation with Iran has dramatically complicated this upcoming meeting. China is quite upset about this, as Eugene previously mentioned. China has offered to mediate the situation. One of the primary reasons for that is Iran has been siphoning off American attention and resources for quite some time, and America right now is not really in a position where it can kind of cover the whole world all at once. And China is particularly concerned that if Iran is to become either neutralized or eliminated as a threat to the United States, then America is going to be able to direct more of its attention toward Beijing and the ongoing Sino-Taiwanese conflict. So China is deeply concerned about that, and that's going to be affecting the negotiations between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping.
Got it. Thanks, Jared. And in the meantime, we've been seeing some notable diplomatic activity out of Canada in the Indo-Pacific. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, the situation in Canada is particularly interesting. They have just concluded a new comprehensive trade agreement with India. And the reason why this is interesting is because for the last several years, Canada and India have had a extremely low mark in their diplomatic relations after the 2023 assassination of Sikh separatist leader Hardeep Najjar. And of course, Canada accuses India of conducting this assassination, as he has been a longstanding separatist element against the Indian state. And for the last several years, they've had consistently bad relations. However, after the new Trump administration took office, the Canadian Prime Minister has been very vocal in his opposition to the American administration. And this seems to be pushing a new, what Mark Carney called the middle power cooperation agreement. And what they're trying to accomplish is to be able to create a sort of counterbalance to where Canada, India, Australia are not going to be as dependent on the major global superpowers for their collective security and economic reliance. They want to try to be able to have some type of strategic autonomy here, not too dissimilar from the non-aligned movement during the Cold War, which of course India was a founding member of. And Canada's kind of main strategic aim here is to be able to maintain some level of strategic autonomy from the United States now that the United States and Canada have had a historic low point in their relations.
Got it. Thanks, Jared. And now moving on to our final global hotspot, which is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So, Andrew, just very quickly, what can you update us outside of the Iranian reverberations in terms of diplomatic updates and hybrid and military updates as well in this theater?
Yeah, so one of the first ways that we saw global ramifications from this new war in the Middle East in a significant way was on the diplomatic process between Ukraine, Russia, and the United States. Long story short, the main story where we left off last week was that there were supposed to be trilateral talks that were going to take place in all places in Abu Dhabi sometime early this month. That, of course, has now been postponed. Both Istanbul and Geneva have been floated as possible alternative venues, but we've seen some statements from Zelensky himself saying that there's a lack of the necessary signals right now from the U.S. So that is on hold, at least in a meaningful way, for the near-term future. And then just very quickly looking at Russia, Russian President Vladimir Putin has publicly floated the idea of cutting off Russian gas exports to Europe to take advantage of the effect of this war in the Middle East on global markets. That is something that he could do, that he might do. I do think right now there's going to be a lot of rhetorical posturing going on from both the Russians and the Ukrainians as both Moscow and Kyiv try to figure out the best way to, one, avoid fallout, and then two, position themselves, advantage themselves at the negotiation table once international attention does once again return to the war in Ukraine.
Understood. Well, that's about all that we have time for this week. Before we wrap up, Jared, were there any quick hits that you wanted to mention elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, we've been seeing actually a couple interesting points. We've seen the Trump administration begin to allow Venezuelan oil to flow to Cuba only if it is under the condition that it is going to be provided to private businesses. And the intention of this is relatively clear, that the United States' policy is to try and undermine the top-down command economy that the communist Cuban government has maintained since its inception. And the idea is to be able to foster a more independent and free market system by only providing oil to free market businesses. This will, of course, encourage Cuban businesses to be able to pull away from that command economy and degrade the overall control that the Cuban government has over its own economy. And then the last major point was what we were seeing in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Pakistan recently declared open war against Afghanistan, which is relatively rare in the modern world. Most countries that fight military conflicts do not officially declare war, as they don't want to have to incur the what are called the belligerent rights that the UN Charter details, where neutral states are not allowed to provide aid to either side if they want to maintain their neutrality. So it's actually pretty rare to see a declaration of open war occur. This occurred after Afghanistan allegedly launched drone attacks against targets in Pakistan. Pakistan then has begun retaliation with its own strikes, and we'll be seeing about how that escalates in the future. As to why Pakistan is particularly interested in pursuing this with a such bold declaration of open war, it's very likely that it has something to do with the fact that the Pakistani military is very active within its government, and the Pakistani military's control within the government is predicated on its idea of competence and success. And after the previous 2025 Indo-Pakistan conflict, where Pakistan was seen to be relatively comprehensively defeated by the Indian strikes, it's possible that this new open declaration of war is the Pakistani military's attempt to maintain its own political power by showing that it is still capable of defending the country competently.
Got it. So we'll have to leave it there. If you'd like more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to the topics that we discussed, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates and analysis around the world. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Jared. Thank you all for listening, and take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. You have a good day.